Good morning, everybody. I hope that you are doing well. I hope that your stay at home, your self-isolation has been going as well. I don't know if you've picked up any new hobbies or have gotten around to doing, I guess, new things. If you've, rearranged your house or maybe finally cleaned out your gutters or get into some other things of that nature. Catherine and I have started trying to run at night when we can kind of be far away from everybody else. Gives us some time to get out of the house and away from some people. Otherwise, it's just backwards and forwards to school. We're in the middle of finals and for my students, and that's been a pretty difficult affair, I think, for us all. But that will be done this coming week. I'm looking forward to have some more time to spend on things like this, to spend time studying the Bible, and hopefully we, of course, will have more time together soon as well. This morning, we're going to be picking up and going through a larger section of text than we normally do. It's a difficult section. I kind of mentioned this at the end of last class in some ways because it's too much really information for one class and not really enough for two. So I was trying to decide if we're going to try to go through it in one class or try to go through it in two classes. But I think that we can summarize some of the events and skim over a few things, and I think that it will work better to try to get through it in one class. So we're going to find out if we can make it through there this morning. Of course, what we're going to be picking up for then this morning is we're going to be following through in our study of the kings of Judah and Israel in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings in our Bibles. And where we're going to be going this morning is in 2 Kings chapter 15 through 17, and this really covers the final 40 years, give or take a few years, of the northern kingdom. And it's mostly, with a few exceptions, told in a very staccato fashion. Most of the events don't have a lot of information. For most of the kings, they're brief stories, they're short summaries. We might get a mention of a transition. We might get an event or two. But by and large, there are no extended narratives. In fact, the one extended narrative we do have almost seems out of place, and we'll talk about why that is at the end of our study. There aren't really any prophets. There aren't really any speeches. Instead, we're just continually faced repeatedly with death and rebellion and failure. And those are all things that are going to be connected. The point of really what we're trying to do in this part of the text, and the point I think of what the inspired author is doing at this point of the text, is to indicate that this is not just bad luck. It's not just poor timing. Instead, God is at work in bringing the judgment on the sins of stubborn people. Israel has for 200 years rebelled against God. None of its kings have removed the golden calves. And we're going to see, finally, God's patience is at an end, that they will be destroyed. And the section here in chapter 15, verses 8 through the end of chapter 17, begins and ends with, although there are no prophets, it begins and ends with the fulfillment of God's promises. It's going to begin with the last king of Jeroboam's line and mention that this is to fulfill God's promise, to Jehu's line and to fulfill God's promise to him. And it's going to conclude with another statement about God's promise to David's line and how those two different situations are going to influence who and what remains at the end of our class this morning. So where we're going to go is we'll start out here then in 2 Kings chapter 15, and we're going to be in verse 8. And we're going to read just a few pieces of this to kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with. And the first thing that we're going to read is we're going to read about what's going on with the king, Zechariah of Israel. So, we have here, in the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah the son of Jeroboam reigned over Israel in Samaria for 6 months. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just like his fathers had done. He did not depart from the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. And Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him, and struck him down at Ibleam, and put him to death, and reigned in his place. Now the rest of the deeds of Zechariah, behold, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. But this was the promise that the Lord had given to Jehu, "Your sons will sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." And so it came to pass. So here we have this last son of Jehu. He's the son of Jeroboam II, but really, as we see, he does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. He continues in the sins of Jeroboam I. And he only rules for 6 months. This is probably 753 or 752 BC. He's the last of Jehu's line. And the most important thing that he does is nothing really that he does, but the fact that he exists, that God's promises have been fulfilled, that God has given exactly what he had said to Jehu. But he only rules for 6 months. And that is because even though God has promised Jehu 4 generations, Jehu's family line has been wicked. They have been evil. And although here Zechariah only rules for 6 months, it's still enough for God to know what kind of a person he is. And God is going to be done with this line. And certainly the Israelites themselves are kind of done with this line. That we see they install or they bring about a military coup. And we have this new guy, Shallum, who comes and takes over. Now, Shallum takes up almost all of Zechariah's information, and the same thing occurs here. We don't have a lot of information about Shallum, just a few verses, but we can read those this morning. It says, "Now Shallum, the son of Jabesh, began to reign in the 39th year of Uzziah, king of Judah, and he reigned 1 month." Just 1 month in Samaria. "And then Menachem, the son of Gadi, came up from Tirzah and came against Samaria and struck down Shallum, the son of Jabesh, and began to put him to death and ruled in his place. Now the rest of the deeds of Shallum and the conspiracy that he made, behold, they are written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. And at that time Menachem sapped Tifsa and all who were in it, and in the territory of Tirzah onwards, because they did not surrender to him. Therefore he sacked it, and he ripped open all of the pregnant women who were there." Now here again we have another situation where another king is overthrown. Now this king, Shallum, only rules for a single month. Now we don't exactly know what's going on with that. Assyrian records call him a son of a nobody, which is kind of their way of saying that he's a usurper, that he doesn't come from a king's line or even necessarily a royal family. But he, we read, is still coming to pass in the rule of Uzziah or Azariah of Judah. And it's the second shortest reign other than Zimri, who we saw earlier in the book of 1 Kings, who ruled for 7 days. And he, just as he has killed his master in a coup, is killed himself. Now, we don't know exactly for sure. One possibility is that just like what we saw with Omri and Zimri, that both Shallum and Menachem were kind of rival generals in some way, and they're both kind of trying to seek the throne. They have different groups of people. But here, we don't have a whole much information at all about him. And like with Zechariah, more of the information is actually about his destruction than his rule. What we have here, though, is one event captured, one event discussed, and that is a foreshadowing, a pretty dangerous and terrifying foreshadowing of what's coming to all of Israel. And that is when Menachem takes over and puts to death his rivals, that one of the villages, one of the towns there at Tifsa doesn't surrender immediately to Menachem. Maybe they had fought for or had aligned with the predecessor. We don't know exactly what happened. But when he takes over the city, he doesn't just do the normal thing. His cruelty extends still further. That we read that he does what Assyria is known to do. That he rips open the pregnant women to kill them in a brutal and horrific fashion. Something else where we see in the Bible that in Amos, the Amorites do. And this is a foreshadowing of destruction. And his other evil deeds and the conspiracy that we get a lot of information about him because, again, it just changes so quickly to Menachem. Now, Menachem is a little bit different. We have a little bit more information about him, but it's still kind of the same sort of a frustrating thing. Notice what happens. In the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Menachem, the son of Gadi, began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 10 years in Samaria. And he also did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart all of his days from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. And Pul the king of Assyria came against the land, and Menachem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that he might help him to confirm his hold on the royal power. And Menachem exacted the money from Israel, that is, from all the wealthy men, 50 shekels of silver from every man, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. Now the rest of the deeds of Menachem and all that he did, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles, the kings of Israel? And Menachem slept with his fathers, and Pekahiah his son reigned in his place. Now here, we've changed to this new king, and at last this king rules longer than 6 months. The first king since Jeroboam II to rule for even a year. He rules from probably 752 to 742 BC. But we read again, front and center is the fact that he is like Jeroboam I, that he does what is evil, that he doesn't move away from the golden calves. And this 10-year reign does not provide the stability that we might think it would provide. Instead, we're going to see that in his reign, one of the reasons we have more information about him is because he brings about and continues some pretty dangerous policies. He introduces an Assyrian king here called Pul. We'll mention him in a second. He's really probably better known as Tiglath-Pileser III. I know some of y'all are like, oh yeah, of course, Tiglath-Pileser III. I knew that way better, right? That's what he's going to be called a little bit later in the biblical story. But it introduces the concept of Assyria into the land and into the Bible here in a way that we haven't seen them in a long time. If you remember at the end of last class, we had mentioned that one of the reasons that Jeroboam II and Joash in Judah were so strong is that Assyria had been weak. Well, Assyrians' weakness didn't last very long. Now they have renewed their strength and come back into power. And we have this guy who's named Pul here in the Bible, later called Tiglath-Pileser III. His name Pul is actually a later throne name for when he captures Babylon, but we don't have to worry too much about that. But he invades. I'll show you a map in a minute about some of his invasions and what he does. But he campaigns for between 2 and 6 years in this area of Palestine, going against Philistia and Edom and all the other groups a little around here. And what happens is Menachem needs to have a better control of the throne, get better, more powerful. Maybe he's experiencing some weakness. Maybe he, like his predecessors, or has got to worry about an uprising or revolt. But he also has to get Assyria off his back. And what he does, unlike what many of the other kings after him are going to do, he decides the easiest way to do that is to pay him off. He's going to pay him tribute. Tribute or taxes or gift or a bribe, however you want to call it. He's going to offer him 1,000 talents of silver, and he splits that up between 50 shekels for all of the wealthy men of the city, all the wealthy men of the nation. Now, the prophets who were speaking at the time of his predecessors, like Amos or Hosea or Isaiah, they all speak and tell about how wealthy the people of Israel are at this time, and how that they're using this wealth rather than to help each other, they're using it to take advantage of the poor. Well, here they themselves have to pay up to protect themselves. And for the first time in this whole line that we're talking about today, then what occurs is Menachem is able to actually hand his throne, his control, over to his son. And his son is going to be named Pekahiah, which is a funny sounding name, I think, in a lot of ways. But let's just read the few verses that we have about Pekahiah. And this comes there in verses 23 through 26. Now in the 15th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekahiah the son of Menachem began to reign over Israel in Samaria. And he reigned for 2 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. And Pekah the son of Remaliah, his captain, conspired against him with 50 men of the people of Gilead, and struck him down in Samaria, in the citadel of the king's house, with Argob and with Ariah, and he put him to death, and he reigned in his place. Now the rest of the deeds of Pekahiah, and all that he did, behold, they are written in the Chronicles, books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. Now here, this guy, he comes to power in the 50th year of Azariah or Uzziah's reign, who's the ruler of Judah. And he only rules for 2 years. So although his father ruled for 10, he's not able to pass on a stable kingdom here. Almost nothing is included of him. He's really more like Zechariah or Shallum than he was like his father. And what we have here is the biggest information, the most information we have about him is that he's conspired about by his own captain of the guard, and he's killed, put to death by these 50 men of Gilead, and we're on to the next king as well. Now this next king, Pekka of Israel, we also have almost no information about. That we read that he comes to power in the 52nd year of Azariah, the king of Judah. So in the 52nd year of Azariah, the king of Judah, Pekah the son of Remaliah began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned for 20 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he'd made Israel to sin. Now in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, this is the person we'd called Pul earlier. Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, came and captured Ijon and Abel-Bet-Maachah and Genoa and Kadesh and Chatzor and Gilead and Galilee and all the land of Naphtali. And he carried off people there captive to Assyria. And then Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and struck him down and put him to death and ruled in his place in the 20th year of Jotham, the king of Uzziah. Know all the rest of the acts of Pekah and all that he did? Behold, they are written in the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. So we have this last king, and then we're going to take a break for a second. This last king that we've been racing through, his name is Pekah. And he's only going to reign for a few years. But we read that, you know who's still king in Judah? It's still Uzziah or Azariah. Now, we remember from last time, Uzziah and Azariah, that he's been punished by God. He, at this point, has leprosy, and he's having to kind of co-rule with his son Jotham, who we also mentioned a little bit last time. We'll see him again today. But this is very much like what we saw during 1 Kings chapter 15 through 18, where we have all these different northern kings come about, and they all rule during the same rule of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. That we can tell the difference between these two kings, that although the northern king is technically stronger, and they're wealthier, and they're richer, and they're more important, that there is just constant turmoil for the northern kingdom. And the point, of course, is God's providence. And it shows the problem that there's no dynasty, there's no sustainability, there's no peace in the northern kingdom, and that's because there is no promise of God that is providing for the kingdom. Again, from an external perspective, Israel has more money, more soldiers, more power, more wealth. They should have more stability. But the south has God's promise to David. And God's promise to David will not fail. God's promises never will fail. And we see that here, even in this kind of repetitive, situation where like, it's another king, and he doesn't really matter, and he doesn't really do anything. We don't have any stories connect to him. It's just one forgettable king dies, and another forgettable king comes to power, and he dies, and another one comes to power, and he's killed, and another one comes to power. And these people don't really matter. And that's kind of the point that God is giving us. The only thing about them that matters is none of them will put away the idols. None of them will do what God has asked. None of them will serve the Lord. Well, this Pekah, this guy does have a little bit more information about him, and that's because that we're going to see a big problem. He rules for 20 years. Now, a 20-year run, he does different things. In fact, the Bible says, look, if you want to know more of information about what he does, go ahead and look at the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Now, again, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel are not the same thing as our biblical book of Chronicles. It's just the source material, I guess, the non-inspired source material for what our biblical authors are doing. And there's also, starting here, we won't get into it too much, but there's some chronological issues that begin starting here in the north, that we're not exactly sure where reigns line up and how those things go. Everything is in chaos, so it makes sense to the numbers as well. But the most important thing that happens during his rule is we have now Tiglath-Pileser show up. This Tiglath-Pileser is the person who we called Pul earlier, and he comes in and he captures a bunch of northern cities that King Pekah had set up in order to try to defend himself against Assyria or Syria. Doesn't work. One of those cities is where I did my archaeological digging, was Abel Bet Maachah. I've shown you all some pictures of that. But we get a list of other ones as well, including, of course, the tribe of Naphtali. They're all taken, and the people are taken into captivity in Assyria. And it seems as though the people don't like this situation there that he does, and they're going to have a rebellion. And this rebellion is going to put in charge a new guy who's going to be the last king of Israel. It's going to be Hoshea. But then our text does something a little strange, honestly. It maybe at least seems strange to us. And what I mean by that is it's going to shift here right at the tippy top, right at the very climax of the action of what's going on in Israel, right before we get to the very last little bit, right before we have the final king and the final years and the final campaign of Assyria. It's as though the biblical author says, wait a second, we need to go talk about something else. We're going to go and now we're going to talk about the southern kingdom. Now, you know, if we were doing this, we'd be like, wait a second, this is frustrating. Well, what, doesn't it interrupt the point? Doesn't it mismanage the focus? Doesn't it change what's going on? But the answer is no, it doesn't. And that is because the focus of the book of Kings, in spite of the fact that it includes much information about Israel, the northern kingdom, it's really about the southern kingdom. And what I mean by that is that this is a book that's really looking towards David and the fulfillment of God's promises to David. It's why we've called this No King Like David. And the focus, as we're doing this, is that here these texts are going to come and to speak about the southern kingdom and to heighten the tension at what we have, to compare, to show that Judah is actually doing the same things as Israel. And if Judah is doing the same things as Israel, it's going to run into the same problems. That look, Judah's ultimate downfall, it will occur more slowly than it does in Israel. And on a pragmatic side, it's because Judah's kings, with some limited exceptions, are going to, especially right here, take a consistently pro-Assyrian policy. But its leaders, just like the leaders in Israel, have failed to recognize the importance of faithfulness to God's covenant. And although Judah's destruction is going to come later, the seeds of that destruction are sown right here. And we see that heightened because we return to talk about Jotham. Now we've seen Jotham before. We had Jotham at the end of our information last time, but we return here to talk about Jotham again. So let's look at that text and see how the Bible mentions. This is verses 32 and following. It says, "Now in the second year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, began to reign." Now, he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done. Nevertheless, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, and he built the upper gate of the house of the Lord. Now, the rest of the acts of Jotham and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And in those days, the Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. And Jotham slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, his father. And Ahaz, his son, reigned in his place. Now here, this Jotham of Judah comes to power during the reign of Pekah, and he's going to rule 16 years in Jerusalem. Probably about 10 of those years were co-regent with his father Uzziah when he had leprosy. And we read that, and this is in stark contrast to what we've been seeing for the northern kingdoms, he does what is right in the eyes of the Lord. He does like his father Uzziah does, with the same caveats and the same problems, and that is that he doesn't remove the high places. And there's a focus here. And that is because we know he does other things. Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles chapter 27, gives us more information. He builds lots of things. He repairs the wall. He builds new towns. He builds new forts and towers. He resubdues the Ammonites who had been in rebellion. But in Kings doesn't focus on those aspects of his life. Instead, Kings focuses on something else. That the Lord began to raise and bring up the king of Syria and the king of Israel against him, and that his son, Ahaz, begins to reign. Now, Ahaz has a lot of information about him in this part of the Bible. In fact, Ahaz has 20 verses, almost an entire chapter here, whereas all of the other kings combined have about the same amount of text. And that tells us two things. First of all, of course, that our inspired writer thinks that there's something really important that we're supposed to pay attention to Ahaz. And so we should do that ourselves. Ahaz is really going to spend kind of the bulk, about half of the rest of our time in this class, and then we'll kind of try to pivot and deal with a few other things. But we're not going to read all of this, but let's read a little bit of what we're going to see here then with Ahaz's rule. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Now Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he too reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. But he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God, like his father David had done. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out from before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed, and he made offerings on the high places, and on the hill, under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem. And they besieged Ahaz, but they couldn't conquer him. At that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria, and drove the men of Judah from Elath. And the Edomites came to Elath, and there they dwell to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria listened to him. And the king of Assyria marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. I'm going to scoot down a little bit. When King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet King Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, he saw the altar that was in Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern exact in all of its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar, in accordance with all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus to Uriah the priest made it, before King Ahaz arrived back from Damascus. And when the king came from Damascus, the king viewed the altar, and the king drew near to the altar, and he went up to it. And he burnt his burnt offerings and his grain offerings, and poured his drink offerings, and he threw the blood of the peace offerings on the altar. The bronze altar that was before the Lord he removed from the front of the house, from its place between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, On the great altar burn the morning burnt offering, and the evening grain offering, and the king's burnt offering, and the grain offering with the burnt offering, and the offering of the land, and the grain offering, and the drink offering, and throw on it all the blood of the burnt offering, and the blood of the sacrifice. But the bronze altar shall just be for me to inquire by. And Uriah the priest did all of this, just as King Ahaz had commanded. And King Ahaz cut off the frames of the stands and removed the basin. And he took down the sea from the bronze auction which were under it, and he put it on a stone pedestal. And the covered way for the Sabbath that had been built inside the house, and the outer entrance for the king, which he caused to go around the house of the Lord, because of the king of Assyria. Now the rest of the acts that King Ahaz did, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Ahaz slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. Now, this is a longer text, obviously, than what we've been seeing before, and it's pretty obvious why. There are kind of a few major events that Ahaz has done, and I think that when we see how those play out, we'll see exactly why our inspired author has spent so much time on this wicked King Ahaz. That here he comes to power, and he is going to reign he's 20 years old, and he's going to rule for 16 years just like his father. And that the first thing that we read about him is that he doesn't do like what David does. He doesn't. He's not interested in serving God in the same way as David did. That he's not going to act in the same way as David acted. That he instead acts like the kings of Israel. That he acts like a northern king. And he goes beyond even the northern kings, although it's going to tie, we'll see in a second when we get to chapter 17, to what the north does. And that is, he even burns his son as a burnt offering. He makes a human sacrifice. He acts like all the nations that God had driven out beside him, that he does what the Canaanites did. And the implication is that if God had driven out the Canaanites, God will drive them out as well. But we also read about this thing that the historians call the Cro Ephraim Might War. The reason they call it the Cro Ephraim Might War, of course, is because the Syria, Rezin of Syria, and the Ephraimites, or the northern people from northern Israel, they come and they attack against Judah. So Rezin of Syria and Pekka of Israel come and they wage war against Judah. Now, there doesn't go into a whole lot of information here in Kings, because everybody who would have been reading and hearing about Kings would have known what was going on. But we may not, so I think it's useful to talk about here in a second. I'll show you a map that maybe, actually, we'll go to the map now, maybe more useful to kind of see what's going on there. I will also zoom in on the map so that maybe you can see something a little bit better. Now here, on the left side of the map, the one I'm circling with the laser pointer, this is a map of what occurs here with the push that is going to come against Judah. You see what is happening at this point is Assyria, who you can see on the right side of the map, Tiglath-Pileser, has been getting really strong. They have been coming down and they have been campaigning. We've seen it before. They're going to do it again. And just like has happened before in the days of Omri, or more importantly in the days of Ahab, and there have been a lot of connections between these chapters and the chapters leading up to Ahab in 1 Kings, that all of the smaller powers, Syria, Philistia, Aram Damascus, all the different Syrian little capital kingdoms, the Sidonians, Phoenicians, the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, all those other people, they had all teamed up to combine their forces, and that combined they were able to fight off Assyria and maintain their regional independence. Well, here, as Assyria is getting stronger again, the two kind of, ringleaders are trying to start another coalition like that. Rezin of Syria and Pekka of Israel want to get a new group of people together, and they're going to fight against the Assyrians. The problem with this is that Judah does not want to join, and if Judah doesn't join, then it's not going to work out. That they need everybody together if this is going to work. And so what do you do? Well, the kingdoms, particularly Syria and Israel, say, well, we've got to get this guy in line before the Assyrians come. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. Oh, sorry I'm yawning so much. There's something about the camera that makes me yawn. I've also had a long night last night trying to get finals ready for everybody, so I apologize about that. But here what happens is they're going to come and they're going to invade Jerusalem. And you can see that if we go back then to the map a little bit, that Aram here, Rezin, king of Aram, or king of Syria, as we've been calling, is going to come down. He's going to join everywhere else. They have kind of set events going on here in Ammon. They have then come in here, joined up with Pekka, and they're going to besiege then Jerusalem. At the same time, some of the other groups of people that have been part of this coalition, the Edomites or the Philistines, also take this time to invade Judah invade Jerusalem. And at this point, Ahaz is feeling really strapped, really in danger, really problematic. It is very likely it is in this context that he would have offered up his son as a burnt offering. And here, stretched and strained and besieged by enemies on every side, Ahaz has a choice that he has to make. And that choice that Ahaz is going to make is, in whom will he trust? In fact, this is going to be the choice that his son, Hezekiah, is also going to have to make. And we know the answer that Ahaz should make. He should trust in the Lord. But Ahaz is not willing to do that. Ahaz will not trust in the Lord. Ahaz instead does the opposite thing. And that is, he's going to make a sacrifice to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of the Assyrians. You notice what happens. Maybe he's tired of being the weaker partner to the north. Maybe he sees this as a chance to empower himself. He goes and he tells Tiglath-Pileser III, he offers him tribute. He ransacks the temple in order to take stuff from him, just as what Israel had done for Syria before. He gives the silver and the gold like Joash had done to the king, and the result is that Assyria comes, they destroy Damascus, and he is safe. But it leads to another problem. And that other problem is this. He goes up north to Damascus to meet the king of Assyria, who has just destroyed Damascus. And Tiglath-Pileser up there has set up an altar to commemorate his victory. And Assyria is strong. And in the view of the ancient peoples, if you were strong, it's because your gods were strong. And so Ahaz sees the power of the Assyrians. He's already worshipped and sacrificed on all the high places that he says, if I want to be powerful, if I want to be like Assyria, I should worship Assyria's gods. He takes meticulous notes of the model of this Assyrian altar, and he sends it to his priest, probably the high priest, Uriah. Now we would think the priest is going to think, no way am I going to build an altar to a pagan god. But this Uriah is like Aaron, and that is, he is happy to build an altar. And this altar replaces the altar of the bronze altar, the most important altar there in the temple. In fact, what happens is it's kind of like he takes the bronze altar, he ships it off into the guest room, I guess we might call, on the north side, not on the east side, which is where it would have been more prominent in its position. And it's not just that, he also kind of remodels the temple in well. He may have stolen the silver and the gold to pay off the Assyrians to come and fight against Syria and Israel, but he even removes the bronze from the implements of God to give more prestige to the Assyrian gods. And all of this is like, it says, for the king of Assyria, that he has become just like the kings of Israel, that he may not have set up golden calves like Jeroboam I, but he has absolutely abandoned God. That he doesn't do, Isaiah in chapter 7 is actually talking about this very situation. He doesn't do what Isaiah says. He doesn't trust in God. Instead, he trusts in idols. He trusts in Assyria, and he trusts in Assyria's gods. And that is a major, major problem. And that occurs, and it's what we're going to see then also when we get to chapter 17 as well. And notice what happens in chapter 17, the first 6 verses. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser the king of Assyria, and Hoshea paid him and his vassals and tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. And for 3 years he besieged it. So we have here Hoshea set up as the last king of the north. And this is important because this king who reigns for 9 years, he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord. And although it's not as bad as what others have done, it doesn't matter, because at this point, it's all undone. But notice, though, what happens, that this Hoshea, this is the same root in Hebrew as Joshua. You hear the Shua, Hoshea. Joshua's name in Hebrew is actually Yehoshua, which is, of course, the name in Greek for or in Hebrew for the Greek Jesus. But there are going to be echoes that we're going to see in a second. But instead of leading his people out of Egypt, he returns to Egypt. That's a big no-no. That he goes to this So. Now, no one exactly knows who this So, king of Egypt, is. There's a few different possibilities. There's this guy named Pianki, there's this guy named Tefnakhet, and there's this guy named Orsorkon IV. No one exactly knows who he is, but regardless, Egypt is weak, and trying to trust in Egypt is a fool's errand, especially because, who do we see find out? That Assyria finds out, because of course Assyria is going to find out. And the Babylonian Chronicles says this: on the 25th day of the month of Tebet, Shalmaneser took his seat on the throne of the land of Assyria, and the city of Samaria he ravaged. And he takes the city in 722 or 721 BC. But for the rest of the text, it focuses on something very, very different. And that is that the rest of the text focuses not on the events, but on the explanation for what happens. And as we just read through this very quickly, and then we'll be wrapping up in just a minute afterwards, is talking about these three events. And that is that what happens with what Israel does is that it's an anti-exodus, it's an anti-conquest, and it's going to condemn Judah's future. And we see that even as we read through a few of these verses. I'm just going to pick a few snippets to read that we can see here, and I encourage you to read a little more closely yourself. That it starts out by talking about the Exodus. It says, and all this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord God, who had brought them up out of Egypt and out from the hand of Pharaoh. And they instead feared other gods. I mean, here what do we see going on? But the very event that starts this, that Joshua brings them into the kingdom, and it's Hoshea who's going to bring them out. That they have forgotten the Exodus and everything that it stood for. They have forgotten that God's power is more powerful than the gods of the nations. That they have forgotten that God could judge all peoples. That if God could bring them out safely from Egypt, he could bring them safely from Assyria. But that's not what they're interested in. Instead, what do we see? That it's not just that they're an anti-Exodus, that it's going to be an anti-conquest as well. Notice what it says there in verse 9. And the people of Israel secretly did against the Lord the things that things that were not right. And they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from their watchtowers and fortified cities, and they set themselves up pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And they made offerings in all the high places, just as the nations did whom the Lord carried away from before them. And they did these wicked things, provoking the God to idols. In other words, when God comes and he brings them to the land, he says, you're going to drive these people out. They're doing abominable practices. They're worshiping false gods. They're worshiping God in the wrong way. They're offering their children to idols. And Israel's like, okay, we're going to do that. And Joshua brings them into the land. And in Joshua 24, he says, as for me and for my house, we're going to serve the Lord, but you guys are going to serve the gods of the nations. And they're like, no, we won't. But what do we see? That they absolutely have. And in the last few verses, in verses 19 through 20, he ties all of this to Judah's future. He says, Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all of his descendants of Israel and afflicted them, and he gave them into the hand of plunderers, and they cast them out of his sight. And the point of all of this is that God has said, listen, this is what's going to happen, not just to Judah, but this is what is going to happen to Israel as well. And what I mean by that is that this looks forward to this last event, this theology of the north. That Assyria, we read in the rest of the chapter, brings in other peoples. They control people through dispersion, and they take out the Israelites, and they bring in a bunch of other people. And these other people don't worship God. And we read that God sends lions to kill these people. So that the king of Assyria is like, oh, we can't have people getting killed by lions. And he listens, and he brings in priests. And the priests of Israel teach the people to fear the Lord. Now, of course, the people don't just fear the Lord. They still worship God, and they worship their other idols, and they do all their other things together. It's going to cause big problems in the future. But what I want to focus on, and as we conclude, is this. And that is that when God sends lions of judgment against Assyria here in this chapter, the king of Assyria listens. But God sent lions before. God has sent lions to Israel and to Judah before. Remember in 1 Kings chapter 13, right after Jeroboam the first sets of the idols, God sends lions to eat that prophet, and they don't listen. In chapter 20, God sends lions, and they don't listen. That Israel will not listen to God, and even Assyria will. What a condemnation against God's people. And it should be a warning for us as well. Are we listening when God is telling us to do things? Are we so convinced that we're right, or so unwilling to get rid of the idols in our lives that nothing will convince us that anything is wrong in any other event? Hope you've had a good class. Look forward to seeing you in a few minutes in the sermon. I look forward to seeing you in person far more. And I hope you have a blessed day.